long before the world you know existed, before nations, before borders, before even the idea of time as we understand it. There was a city that believed it would last forever, and for a while, it almost did. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Take a moment to settle in, wherever you are in the world right now. Maybe you're lying in bed, lights off, letting the day slowly fade away. Or maybe you're just searching for something calm to drift into sleep with. Either way, you've found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. There's something incredible about this. People from all over the world, different countries, different time zones, all sharing this quiet moment together. So leave a comment and tell me where you are. I read every single one, and it makes this feel like a shared journey rather than just a story. And if you've been here before, there's something I want to mention. More than 90% of the people who listen to these videos aren't subscribed. If that's you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it motivates me to keep creating these long, immersive stories designed to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep. Now, there's nothing you need to do, no thoughts to hold on to, no distractions to follow. Tonight, we're stepping into the slow unfolding of one of the greatest civilizations in history, the Roman Empire. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let the world fade as the story begins. Long before Rome became an empire, before emperors clothed themselves in purple and sent orders from the Palatine Hill to the edges of Britain, Syria, and the Sahara, there was only a small settlement by a river in central Italy. Its people did not know they were standing at the beginning of one of the longest and most influential political stories in human history. They knew the Tiber, the hills, the marshes, the dangers of neighboring peoples, and the stubborn work of survival. The Roman Empire did not appear all at once. It was not born with marble forums and legions planted across continents. It grew out of mud, warfare, migration, ambition, and the slow hardening of institutions. To understand the empire, you have to begin before the empire existed, in the age when Rome was only one Latin town among many, and when its future was still uncertain. The Romans themselves told a story about their beginning that mixed memory with legend. They said that after the fall of Troy, the hero Aeneas escaped the burning city and carried his household gods westward across the sea. After many wanderings, he came to Italy, where his descendants eventually founded the line that led to Romulus and Remus. These twins, so the story went, were born of royal blood, exposed as infants, and suckled by a she-wolf, before being raised by a shepherd's family. When they grew, they decided to found a city near the place where they had been saved. A quarrel followed, and Romulus killed Remus. From this act of blood and foundation, Rome entered the world. The traditional date the Romans gave for the city's founding was 753 BC. Modern history cannot accept the story literally, but it cannot dismiss it entirely either, because myths reveal what a people believed about themselves. Rome imagined its origin as violent, fated, and divinely watched. It tied itself to Troy, one of the great epic centers of the Greek world, as if to say that Roman history belonged to the same heroic universe. It imagined its founder not as a peaceful lawgiver, but as a man who crossed a line in blood to establish order. The legend also hinted at a truth visible throughout Roman history. Rome was always skilled at turning outsiders into ancestors and conflict into legitimacy. Archaeology suggests that early Rome emerged gradually from scattered settlements on the hills overlooking a ford of the Tiber River. That crossing mattered. The site sat inland enough to be safer from pirates than a coastal settlement, but close enough to the sea for trade. It also stood near routes connecting Etruria in the north, Latium in the center, and Campania in the south. Salt, livestock, metals, pottery, and people moved through the region. Rome's location did not guarantee greatness, but it gave the settlement opportunity. Geography offered a stage. Human ambition would do the rest. In the earliest centuries, the region was a mosaic of peoples. The Latins lived in the area around Rome. The Sabines occupied neighboring uplands. To the north were the Etruscans, wealthier and more urbanized than the early Romans, with powerful city-states, sophisticated art, engineering skill, and far-reaching cultural influence. To the south, Greek colonies lined the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily, bringing with them writing, religion, trade, and examples of organized urban life. Rome developed in contact with all these worlds. It was never born in isolation. Even at the beginning, Roman civilization was already a mixture. The Romans later believed that they had once been ruled by 7 kings. Whether there were exactly 7 is doubtful, but the tradition reflects a real monarchical phase in early Roman history. These kings, according to Roman memory, included figures who embodied different aspects of the city's development. Romulus was the founder and warrior. Numa Pompilius was remembered as a lawgiver and religious organizer. Tullus Hostilius represented war again. Ancus Marcius combined religion and expansion. Then came kings associated more clearly with Etruscan influence, including Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. These names stand on the border between legend and history, but the larger pattern matters. During the regal period, Rome became more than a hilltop village. It grew into a real city. Its marshy valleys were drained, most famously through the Great Sewer, later called the Cloaca Maxima. Public spaces were organized, temples were built. Political and military structures took shape. Religious rituals were formalized. The city's population expanded by absorbing neighboring groups, refugees, dependents, and conquered people. Rome learned early that growth could come not only by birth, but by incorporation. One of the most revealing traditions about Romulus was the so-called asylum. The story said that he opened a refuge for fugitives, exiles, debtors, and outcasts from surrounding communities, swelling the new city's population with men who had no place elsewhere. Whether literally true or not, the story captures a fundamental Roman habit. Rome had a remarkable ability to take in the displaced, the ambitious, and the defeated, then bind them into a larger system. This was one of the roots of its future power. Many ancient states remained closed and narrow. Rome, by contrast, grew by widening itself, though never gently and never equally. The monarchy, however, did not survive. Roman tradition held that the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, became tyrannical, and that the outrage committed by his son Sextus Tarquinius against a noblewoman named Lucretia sparked a revolt. Lucretia, after calling her kin to witness the crime, took her own life. Her death became the moral fire that destroyed the kingship. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus and other aristocrats, the Romans expelled the Tarquins and swore never again to be ruled by a king. The date traditionally given for this revolution is 509 BC. Whether events happened exactly this way is less important than what the story meant to later Romans. The hatred of kingship became central to Roman political culture. Even when Rome eventually came to be ruled by emperors with powers far greater than those of the old kings, the language of monarchy remained dangerous. Romans remembered liberty not as democracy in the modern sense, but as the condition of not living under a king's arbitrary will. This memory would shape Roman politics for centuries and would haunt even the emperors themselves. The republic that replaced the kings was not a republic of equality. It was an aristocratic commonwealth dominated by elite families, the patricians, who claimed special hereditary status. At first, power rested heavily in their hands. The monarchy's functions were divided among annual magistrates, most importantly, 2 consuls, who held executive and military authority and were meant to check one another. The Senate, a council of elders drawn from leading families, became the enduring center of guidance, prestige, and continuity. In times of emergency, a dictator could be appointed for a limited term. Religion remained embedded in politics. Omens, priesthoods, and sacred law were not separate from public life, but woven into it. Yet the early republic was unstable. The Roman citizen body included many plebeians, commoners who served in the army, paid taxes, farmed the land, and sustained the city, but who lacked the full political privileges monopolized by the aristocracy. Debt, military burdens, and legal inequality drove conflict between the orders. Over the 5th and 4th centuries BC, plebeians repeatedly pressured the patrician elite through secessions, organized withdrawals from the city, and political struggle. They demanded protection from arbitrary power, access to office, and public visibility in law. Out of these struggles emerged some of the defining institutions of Roman republican life. The office of tribune of the plebs was created to defend plebeians against abuses. Tribunes were sacrosanct and could intervene against magistrates. The 12 Tables, traditionally dated to the mid-5th century BC, represented one of the earliest Roman law codes, written down and publicly displayed, limiting the aristocracy's monopoly over legal knowledge. Over time, plebeians gained access to major magistracies and priesthoods. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the formal distinction between patrician and plebeian mattered less than the broader dominance of a new governing nobility, made up of successful families from both groups. This long struggle did not create modern democracy, but it did produce something politically durable, a state in which conflict was not eliminated, yet repeatedly channeled into institutions. Roman society remained deeply unequal, but it learned how to absorb elite competition and popular pressure without collapsing. This capacity for controlled conflict would become one of the Republic's great strengths, though later it would fail under the weight of empire. While these internal struggles unfolded, Rome was also fighting for survival in Italy. The early Republic faced hostile neighbors and suffered serious threats. One of the most famous was the Gallic sack of Rome, traditionally dated to 390 BC, though some ancient chronologies place it at 387. A Gallic warband defeated Roman forces at the river Allia and entered the city. Later, Roman memory was traumatized by this event. The image of barbarian invaders overrunning Rome never faded. It left behind a fear of sudden catastrophe and a determination never to be so vulnerable again. Rome's response to danger was not withdrawal, but expansion. Over the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, it fought a series of hard wars that transformed it from a regional Latin power into the dominant state of the Italian peninsula. This process was not smooth or inevitable. It required repeated mobilization, recovery after defeat, and a growing ability to draw manpower from allied communities. First came the Latin War of 340 to 338 BC, after which Rome dissolved the old Latin League and reorganized relations with neighboring communities under Roman leadership. Some towns received Roman citizenship, some partial rights, and others allied status. This flexible system was crucial. Rome did not rule every conquered people in the same way. It graded privilege, imposed obligations, and built layers of dependency. Citizenship could be extended selectively. Local elites could be integrated. Military service became both burden and pathway. Then came the Samnite Wars, a prolonged struggle against the Samnites, fierce highland peoples of central southern Italy. These wars, fought across much of the 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, were grueling and often humiliating. The Romans suffered a famous disgrace at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, where an army was trapped and forced to pass under the yoke as a sign of submission. Yet Rome did not accept lasting defeat. It kept returning to the field, raising new armies, building roads, founding colonies, and tightening its grip on strategic territory. Roads were one of the Republic's quiet weapons. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC, linked Rome to Campania and later farther south. Roman roads were not merely lines of stone. They were instruments of movement, logistics, administration, and psychological control. They allowed armies to march faster, goods to circulate more reliably, and influence to travel outward from the city. A road announced permanence. It said Rome was not passing through. Rome intended to stay. Colonies served a similar purpose. Roman and Latin colonies planted loyal populations in contested areas, securing roots and extending influence. These were not colonies in the later overseas imperial sense, but fortified communities tied to Roman power. The Republic expanded through a network, not only through direct occupation. Its genius lay in connection. The final major challenge to Roman dominance in Italy came from the Greek world of the south. The city of Tarentum, threatened by Roman expansion, called on King Pyrrhus of Epirus for aid. Pyrrhus was one of the great Hellenistic warlords of his age, a cousin to the successors of Alexander the Great. He arrived in Italy in 280 BC with a powerful army and war elephants, beasts unfamiliar and terrifying to Roman troops. At Heraclea and Asculum, he defeated the Romans, but at such cost that his victories could not be sustained. From this came the phrase, Pyrrhic victory, a win so expensive it is nearly a loss. Pyrrhus eventually withdrew, and Rome emerged stronger for having faced him. The significance of the war went beyond Italy. Rome had now confronted a major Hellenistic king and survived. It had measured itself against one of the military traditions descended from Alexander's conquests. By 272 BC, after the submission of Tarentum, Rome was master of southern Italy as well. By the early 3rd century BC, the Roman Republic controlled most of the peninsula, though control varied in form and intensity. This new Roman Italy was not a unified nation-state. It was a hierarchy of communities bound by treaties, duties, and unequal partnership. Roman citizens held the core. Allied peoples supplied troops. Colonies secured positions. Roads linked regions. Local identities remained alive, but Rome sat at the center of the system. The city had become something larger than itself. It had learned how to convert conquest into structure. That achievement would soon pull Rome into a wider Mediterranean struggle. Across the sea lay Carthage, the great Phoenician-founded power of North Africa, wealthy, naval, commercial, and formidable. Sicily, divided among Greek cities, local powers, and Carthaginian interests, would become the meeting point of two expanding systems. Rome had mastered Italy, but Italy was no longer enough. The habits formed in the hills beside the Tiber had grown into a machine of alliance, discipline, and war. It was now poised to collide with a rival unlike any it had yet faced. When Rome first turned outward beyond Italy, it did not yet think of itself as a world empire. It still thought like a hard, disciplined republic, surrounded by threats, obliged to secure itself through strength. But power has a way of changing the imagination of those who wield it. A state that conquers for safety soon finds that every new frontier creates a new danger. Every victory opens another question, and every rival left standing feels like a future war. This is how Rome crossed from an Italian power into a Mediterranean one. The crossing happened through conflict with Carthage, and in that conflict, Rome discovered both the scale of its own endurance and the cost of becoming great. Carthage, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, was a very different power from Rome. It had been founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers from Tyre and had grown into the dominant maritime and commercial power of the Western Mediterranean. Its wealth came from trade, shipping, agriculture, tribute, and its far-reaching network of ports and alliances. Carthaginian influence stretched across North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, parts of Spain, and western Sicily. If Rome's strength lay in land warfare, manpower, and alliance systems, Carthage's strength lay at sea. It possessed experience, money, and a naval tradition far older than anything Rome could claim. The place where the two powers met was Sicily. The island sat between Italy and North Africa, rich and strategically placed, and it had long been contested among Greek cities, local Sicilian peoples, and Carthaginians. Rome had never before launched itself into a major overseas war, and many in the Republic likely saw little reason to do so. But events in the Sicilian city of Messana drew Roman intervention across the strait, and once Roman and Carthaginian forces stood in opposition there, withdrawal became harder than escalation. What began as a limited response turned into the First Punic War, fought from 264 to 241 BC. The word Punic came from the Latin term for Phoenician, And this first war was unlike anything Rome had faced before. To defeat Carthage, Rome could no longer rely only on the habits that had mastered Italy. It needed ships, fleets, and sailors. It needed to fight on water against a state whose entire character had been shaped by the sea. For a land power to challenge Carthage in naval warfare seemed almost absurd. Yet Rome did what it often did when confronted by a form of weakness. It transformed it into a problem of organization. According to ancient tradition, the Romans used a captured Carthaginian vessel as a model and rapidly built a fleet. Whether that account is exactly true or somewhat dramatized, Rome clearly undertook a vast naval effort in an astonishingly short time. It also developed a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge that could lock onto an enemy ship and allow Roman soldiers to fight hand to hand, turning sea battle into something closer to land combat, where Rome felt more confident. This adaptation reveals a deep Roman instinct. Rome did not always win because it was the most elegant or naturally gifted power. It often won because it could identify the core of an enemy's advantage and try to drag the contest onto ground more favorable to itself. The First Punic War was long, brutal, and expensive. It did not unfold as a smooth Roman ascent. Fleets were wrecked in storms, armies were trapped, resources were consumed on a staggering scale. One Roman expedition even crossed into North Africa, only to end in disaster. But what Carthage had perhaps not expected was Rome's resilience. Rome could lose fleets and build more. It could suffer reverses and continue mobilizing. Behind its armies stood the manpower of Italy, drawn from Roman citizens and allied communities bound into Rome's military system. Defeat hurt Rome, but defeat did not stop Rome. That distinction mattered. At sea, the war seesawed. Victories and defeats followed one another. Roman commanders were often inexperienced in naval matters, and nature itself proved a deadly enemy. More than once, storms shattered Roman fleets and drowned thousands. Yet the Republic kept returning. That stubborn refusal to accept limits wore down Carthage. In the end, a decisive Roman naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC forced Carthage to sue for peace. The result was historic. Rome gained Sicily, its first province outside Italy, and Carthage had to pay a large indemnity. This was a turning point, though perhaps it did not feel that way immediately to everyone living through it. Rome had begun as a city-state, grown into the master of Italy, and now held territory beyond the peninsula. A new form of rule had emerged. Provinces would be governed by Roman magistrates after their terms in office, and conquered populations would provide revenue to the Roman state. Sicily was not integrated like Italy. It was ruled. The distinction mattered. In Italy, Rome had built a hierarchy of allies and citizens. In the provinces, Rome learned how to extract. Not long after the war, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica as well, taking advantage of Carthage's internal troubles during the Mercenary War. To Carthaginians, this Roman move looked ruthless and opportunistic, and with good reason. It deepened Carthaginian resentment and made future conflict more likely. Meanwhile, Carthage turned towards Spain, where the Barca family, especially Hamilcar Barca, began to build a new base of power and wealth. Hamilcar had fought Rome in Sicily and had no reason to trust the permanence of peace. In Spain, he sought resources, soldiers, and perhaps the foundation for Carthage's recovery. Rome, for its part, did not stop expanding elsewhere. It became increasingly involved in the Adriatic and the Greek East, suppressing piracy and extending influence. Yet the central drama of this era remained the rivalry with Carthage, because in Spain, that rivalry was being shaped by a new generation. Hamilcar's son Hannibal would become one of the greatest military commanders in history, and the war he launched would push Rome closer to destruction than any enemy ever had before or would again for centuries. Hannibal grew up in the shadow of defeat and revenge. Ancient sources tell a powerful story that as a child he was brought by his father to an altar and made to swear eternal hatred toward Rome. Whether literally true or not, it captures the spirit Roman writers believe defined him. He emerged as a commander in Carthaginian Spain, inheriting both the ambitions and the grievances of the Barca family. When he attacked the city of Saguntum, south of the Ebro River but allied to Rome, tensions snapped into open war. In 218 BC, the Second Punic War began. The Roman expectation may have been that the conflict would follow familiar lines, with armies and fleets moving in Spain, Sicily, or Africa. Hannibal shattered those assumptions. In one of the most astonishing campaigns in military history, he marched from Spain across southern Gaul, crossed the Rhone, then led his army over the Alps into Italy itself. The march was a feat of endurance, improvisation, and will. The mountains, cold, hostile tribes, and lack of supplies devoured his forces. Many men and animals perished, but enough survived. When Hannibal descended into northern Italy, Rome faced not merely a foreign invasion, but a commander who had done what should have been impossible. The shock was immense. Rome had built its sense of security on the strength of Italy. Now war was brought directly into that heartland. Hannibal proved almost immediately that he was no ordinary enemy. He defeated Roman forces at the Ticinus and the Trebia in 218 BC, then lured and destroyed another army at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC in one of history's greatest ambushes. Entire Roman formations vanished into death, confusion, fog, and water. Panic spread. The Republic appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius understood something essential. Hannibal was too dangerous to confront recklessly in open battle. The Carthaginian commander excelled at tactical maneuver, deception, and exploiting Roman aggressiveness. Fabius adopted a strategy of delay, harassment, and attrition. He shadowed Hannibal, cut off supplies, and avoided decisive engagement. It was an intelligent policy, but it was unpopular. Roman culture admired courage, initiative, and battlefield glory. Fabian caution looked to many like cowardice. The Republic, under pressure and frustration, eventually turned back toward direct confrontation. That decision led to Cannae in 216 BC, one of the most devastating defeats Rome ever suffered. The Romans assembled an enormous army, perhaps one of the largest they had ever fielded, determined to crush Hannibal by sheer force. On the plains of Apulia, Hannibal accepted battle and arranged his troops with extraordinary skill. He allowed his center to bend inward under Roman pressure, while his stronger African infantry held firm on the flanks. His cavalry routed the Roman horse, then returned to attack from behind. The Roman infantry, packed tightly and pressing forward, found itself enclosed. The slaughter was immense. Ancient numbers are probably exaggerated, but there is no doubt that tens of thousands of Romans and allies died. Senators, magistrates, officers, and ordinary citizens fell together in the crush. Cannae became a symbol of annihilation, a military textbook in encirclement, and a trauma engraved into Roman memory. After such a defeat, many states would have sought terms. Some expected Rome to collapse. Several Italian allies did defect, including Capua, one of the most important cities in Italy. Macedon made contact with Hannibal. Syracuse in Sicily shifted away from Rome. Everything that Rome had built seemed to tremble. Yet this is the moment that revealed perhaps the deepest source of Roman power. Rome did not surrender. It refused negotiations. It barred mourning from becoming despair. It raised new armies, armed younger and older men, and continued the war. The Republic's institutions, though shaken, held. Its alliance system, though strained, did not entirely break. Many Italian communities remained loyal. Hannibal could win battles with astonishing brilliance, but he could not force Rome to admit defeat. He lacked the siege equipment, and perhaps the political support from Carthage needed to strike at the city itself decisively. He could devastate Italy, but devastation was not enough. From this point, the war became a long contest of endurance. Rome increasingly avoided giving Hannibal the decisive battle he wanted. It fought him indirectly, pressed his allies, and attacked Carthaginian positions elsewhere. In Spain, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, emerged as a commander of rare imagination and confidence. After his father and uncle were killed in the war, he took command and gradually turned the tide in the peninsula. His capture of New Carthage in 209 BC was a major blow to Carthaginian power in Spain, both militarily and psychologically. Scipio was not Hannibal's equal in style because he did not need to be. He learned from the war he was fighting. He adapted. He built relationships with local leaders. He trained his army carefully and cultivated his own image as a commander favored by the gods. Eventually, he broke Carthaginian strength in Spain, denying Hannibal a crucial source of reinforcements and resources. Rome was beginning to regain strategic control, even while Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy. The Roman reconquest of Capua, the siege and fall of Syracuse, and continued pressure across multiple theaters steadily narrowed Hannibal's opportunities. Syracuse had mattered not only politically, but intellectually, for during its siege, the great mathematician Archimedes was said to have designed defensive machines that astonished Roman attackers. When the city fell in 212 BC, one of the great centers of Greek culture and science passed into Roman hands. The war was not only remaking politics, it was drawing Rome deeper into the Greek world, exposing it to wealth, art, thought, and habits that would transform Roman culture in the generations ahead. The final act came when Scipio carried the war into North Africa. This was a bold, strategic reversal. By threatening Carthage itself, he forced the recall of Hannibal from Italy after more than 15 years of campaigning there. Hannibal had spent much of a generation marching across Roman lands, winning victories that should have rewritten history, yet he was called home to defend the city that had sent him. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal. The battle was hard fought, but the outcome ended Carthage's chance of matching Rome as an equal power. The peace terms were severe. Carthage lost its overseas possessions, surrendered much of its fleet, paid a vast indemnity, and could not wage war without Roman permission. It remained wealthy and alive, but no longer sovereign in the old sense. Rome, by contrast, now stood preeminent in the Western Mediterranean. It had not merely survived Hannibal, it had broken the most dangerous enemy it would ever face. And yet victory carried poison within it. Rome's success accelerated changes that would destabilize the Republic from within. War on this scale enriched commanders, opened new provinces, flooded Italy with slaves, and increased the gap between rich and poor. Aristocratic competition intensified because conquest brought glory and wealth beyond earlier measure. Contact with the Greek world deepened, bringing admiration, anxiety, and cultural transformation. The Roman state had become larger than the city that governed it. Its institutions had been designed for an Italian republic, not a Mediterranean empire. Even after Zama, Roman expansion did not stop. In the east, the Hellenistic kingdoms that had arisen from Alexander's empire were already entangled in wars of succession, rivalry, and diplomacy. Rome was drawn into Macedonian affairs and soon into the politics of Greece and Asia Minor. Officially, Roman leaders often claimed they were defending allies or preserving freedom. In practice, every intervention widened Roman influence. The methods varied. Sometimes Rome annexed directly. Sometimes it imposed treaties. Sometimes it left kings on their thrones while hollowing out their independence. The language of liberation often concealed the reality of dominance. The Republic was entering a new age. The old farmer-soldier ideal, though still praised, was becoming less representative of the real distribution of power. Armies marched farther, stayed away longer, and returned with loot, prisoners, and stories from a wider world. Generals gained prestige that could overshadow the civic balance of republican life. The Senate still governed, magistrates were still elected, and traditions still held immense force. But the scale of Rome's obligations and ambitions had changed forever. The child of the Tiber had outgrown Italy. It had crossed the sea, learned to build fleets, endured catastrophe, crushed Carthage, and discovered that no victory remained local once the Mediterranean opened before it. Yet for all the grandeur of that rise, the future danger was already visible. Rome could defeat enemies abroad with extraordinary discipline. The harder question was whether it could survive the consequences of having no equal left to fear. After the defeat of Hannibal and the submission of Carthage, Rome stood in a position that would have seemed almost unimaginable only a few generations earlier. It had mastered Italy, broken the greatest naval power in the Western Mediterranean, and proven that even catastrophic defeat could not destroy its political will. But power rarely grants rest. Instead, it creates new entanglements, and by the early 2nd century, BC Rome was being drawn ever deeper into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the ancient lands of Greece, Macedon, Asia Minor, and the fractured kingdoms that had grown from the empire of Alexander the Great. In those regions, cities were old, dynasties were rich, philosophy was refined, and political intrigue had been sharpened by centuries of competition. Rome entered this world claiming often that it wanted security, balance, and the freedom of Greek states. Yet with each war and treaty, it expanded its authority. It was becoming not just strong, but indispensable, and that is one of the most dangerous transformations a republic can undergo. The first great Eastern rival Rome confronted was Macedon under King Philip V. During the long agony of the Second Punic War, Philip had seen opportunity in Rome's apparent weakness and had aligned himself, at least loosely, with Hannibal. That connection was enough to make him suspect in Roman eyes, though the immediate conflict between Rome and Macedon had been limited and inconclusive. After Hannibal's defeat, however, Rome could turn its attention eastward with greater force. Greek states, fearful of Philip's ambitions, appealed to Rome. The Republic now had both motive and invitation. In 200 BC, the Second Macedonian War began. This war is important, not only because of its military outcome, but because it revealed how Rome liked to present itself in the Greek East. Roman leaders did not normally announce that they intended to conquer the Greeks. Instead, they spoke the language of alliance and liberation. Greek cities had long valued autonomy, however fragile, and the phrase, "freedom of the Greeks," had immense political weight. Rome learned to use that phrase well. It could intervene as a protector and emerge as a master. The war ended in 197 BC at the Battle of Cynoscephalae, where Roman forces under Titus Quinctius Flamininus defeated Philip V. The battle also carried symbolic significance because it demonstrated the superiority, at least under those conditions, of the Roman legion over the Macedonian phalanx. The phalanx, with its dense ranks of soldiers carrying long sarissas, had once made Macedon the terror of the Hellenistic world. But it was less flexible on broken terrain and more vulnerable when its formation was disrupted. The Roman legion, organized into maniples, could adapt more fluidly. Roman writers later loved this battle because it seemed to show that their military system had surpassed the inheritance of Alexander. In 196 BC, at the Isthmian Games, Flamininus proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks. The announcement was greeted with enthusiasm. To many Greeks, Rome appeared as a distant but powerful arbiter, capable of checking Macedonian domination. Yet the meaning of freedom under Roman protection was already ambiguous. A city might be free from Macedon and still dependent on Rome's favor. The Republic was not yet annexing the Greek world wholesale, but it was making itself the ultimate judge of its political future. The Eastern Mediterranean, however, contained more than Macedon. The Seleucid Empire, stretching across much of Asia, was still one of the largest states in the post-Alexandrian world. Under Antiochus III, known as Antiochus the Great, it attempted a revival of power and influence. He moved into Asia Minor and Greece, and some Greek factions, including the Aetolian League, encouraged him to challenge Rome. He was even joined for a time by Hannibal, now an exile from Carthage and still Rome's most famous enemy. The image is striking. The defeated Carthaginian genius advising an Eastern king in yet another effort to resist Roman ascent. But history was moving against them. Rome defeated Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. The resulting peace sharply limited Seleucid influence in Asia Minor and confirmed Rome as the decisive power in the region, even though Rome still preferred indirect control where possible. This pattern repeated itself again and again. Rome did not always annex territory immediately. It often imposed settlements, weakened rivals, rewarded allies, and left behind a political order that could not function without Roman approval. Direct empire and hegemonic supervision were not opposites. They were stages, and Rome moved between them with increasing ease. Meanwhile, Macedon itself had not ceased to be a problem. Philip V was succeeded by his son Perseus, who alarmed Rome by rebuilding Macedonian prestige. This led to the Third Macedonian War. In 168 BC, at the Battle of Pydna, the Romans decisively defeated Perseus. Once again, the Macedonian phalanx broke before the flexibility of Roman forces. Perseus was captured, Macedon was dismantled, and the Old Kingdom that had once conquered Greece and shattered Persia under Alexander was reduced to dependence, and then, eventually, provincial status. The symbolism would not have been lost on Romans or Greeks. The heirs of a once obscure Italian city had humbled the dynastic legacy of Alexander. Greek reactions to Roman dominance were mixed. Some elites embraced Roman friendship and found opportunities in the new order. Others resented interference, humiliation, and the steady erosion of autonomy. Greek intellectuals were fascinated by Rome, even as they lamented its power. Polybius, the Greek historian who lived for years in Rome after being taken there as a political hostage, became one of the most penetrating interpreters of Roman greatness. He admired Rome's institutions, especially the mixed constitution of Senate, magistrates, and assemblies, and argued that Rome's success came from discipline, civic structure, and an exceptional capacity to endure setbacks. Yet Polybius was also writing from within the reality of Roman supremacy. His analysis carried the sharpness of someone studying the machine that had absorbed his world. In 146 BC, two events occurred that are often seen as a grim pair, marking the end of one phase of Roman expansion and the beginning of another. In the West, Rome destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic War. In the East, it crushed Corinth and asserted direct control over Greece. These acts, though distinct in cause and context, together showed how far Rome had moved beyond the cautious republic that once entered Sicily with hesitation. The Third Punic War had deep roots in fear, resentment, and Roman political theatre. Carthage, though weakened after Zama, had recovered economically. It remained disarmed in strategic terms, but its prosperity disturbed Roman observers. One of the most famous was Cato the Elder, who reportedly ended speeches on many topics with the insistence that Carthage must be destroyed. Whether the phrase became ritualized later or was truly his repeated habit, it reflected a broader mood. Rome no longer wanted merely a subordinate Carthage. It wanted finality. The immediate trigger came from conflict between Carthage and Numidia, whose king Massinissa was an ally of Rome and had repeatedly encroached on Carthaginian territory. Bound by treaty not to wage war without Roman permission, Carthage was placed in an impossible position. When it resisted Numidian aggression, Rome treated this as a breach. Roman demands escalated until they became intolerable, including, according to ancient sources, the requirement that Carthage abandon its city and move inland. That was effectively a demand for civilizational suicide. The Carthaginians chose resistance. The siege that followed was fierce and desperate. Deprived of hope, the people of Carthage fought with the energy of those defending not merely walls, but memory, ancestors, and identity. Men and women labored to make weapons. Houses became workshops. The city endured starvation and assault. Finally, in 146 BC, Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, captured the city after brutal street fighting. Carthage was burned. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Later legend claimed that the Romans sowed salt into the earth, though that detail is not supported by the ancient evidence. The reality was terrible enough without embellishment. A great city of the Mediterranean was erased as a political power. The destruction of Carthage carried a psychological force greater than its immediate strategic necessity. It told the world that Rome, when it chose, could annihilate an ancient rival completely. But it also told Romans something about themselves. The republic that had once fought for survival against Hannibal had become capable of calculated obliteration. Victory was no longer only defensive. It could now be absolute, punitive, and theatrical. In the same year, Roman forces destroyed Corinth after a revolt by the Achaean League. Corinth was wealthy and culturally illustrious, one of the major cities of Greece. Its fall was another warning. The Greek world, so admired by Roman elites, so rich in art, philosophy, rhetoric, and literature, could be plundered and subordinated like any other. The contradiction was profound. Rome loved Greek culture and conquered Greek freedom. Roman nobles decorated their homes with Greek statues, sent their sons to learn Greek letters, quoted Greek thought, and yet presided over the political humiliation of Greek cities. This contradiction would shape Roman civilization permanently. As Roman power spread east, Greek influence flowed west into Rome with equal force. Roman religion absorbed Greek gods under Latin names and Greek interpretation. Roman literature began under the shadow of Greek models. Roman education became increasingly bilingual among elites. Greek tutors, doctors, artists, and intellectuals appeared in Roman households. Roman architecture, sculpture, and philosophy all drew heavily from Greek precedents. Conquered Greece, as Horace would later write, in one of the most famous lines of Roman literature, took captive her savage conqueror. That line captured a truth, though the conquest itself had been anything but poetic for the cities defeated. Yet alongside the cultural flowering came deeper problems within Rome itself. As the Republic expanded, wealth poured into Italy in unprecedented quantities. Tribute, indemnities, provincial taxation, slaves, war booty, and commercial opportunities enriched the upper classes. Senators and equestrians invested in land, contracts, and influence. Great estates, or latifundia, grew larger in parts of Italy, often worked by enslaved labor captured in Rome's wars. Small farmers, long celebrated as the moral backbone of the Republic, struggled under debt, military absence, and competition. Some lost their land and drifted toward Rome, swelling the city's urban population. This mattered because the Roman Republic had always rested on a certain social fiction, one that was only partly true even in earlier times. It imagined itself as a commonwealth of citizens bound by shared duty, with the farmer-soldier at its center. That ideal gave moral shape to Roman politics, but now the structure of empire was eroding the conditions that supported it. The men who served in Rome's armies were often absent for long campaigns overseas. Their farms could decline while they fought. Meanwhile, elites accumulated land and wealth on a scale the early republic had never known. Slavery, too, expanded enormously. Enslaved people were not a new feature of Roman society, but conquest multiplied their numbers dramatically. Prisoners of war from Spain, Greece, Macedon, Africa, and elsewhere were sold into bondage. They worked in households, workshops, fields, and mines. Their labor underpinned aristocratic wealth and urban life. Their suffering was immense, and their presence altered the social fabric of Italy. The republic that praised liberty for its citizens built much of its prosperity on the unfreedom of others. Politics in Rome grew more competitive and more corrupt as the rewards of office increased. To govern a province could mean access to immense opportunities for enrichment, legal or illegal. Provincial subjects often found themselves at the mercy of Roman officials whose term in office was brief, but whose appetite for extraction was large. The Senate still imagined itself as the steward of a moral order, yet it increasingly presided over a system in which power abroad intensified greed at home. At the same time, Rome itself was changing from a stern Italian city into a true Mediterranean capital. Foreign cults, new luxuries, artistic tastes, and intellectual debates entered elite life. Some Romans celebrated this as refinement. Others feared moral decline. Cato the Elder stood as a voice of old severity, suspicious of Greek influence, luxury, and softness. He represented a recurring Roman anxiety. That conquest had not only enriched Rome, but weakened the character that had made conquest possible. This tension between admiration for cosmopolitan culture and nostalgia for ancestral austerity would echo through Roman literature and politics for generations. Roman identity during this period therefore became more complex. The Republic was still formally governed through annual magistracies, popular assemblies, and the Senate. Civic religion still sanctified public life. The memory of the ancestors still disciplined rhetoric. Yet under the surface, a new empire was pressing against old forms. Rome had become a state of vast distances, diverse populations, and mounting inequality. The constitutional machinery had not been redesigned to match the scale of its dominion. Instead, institutions built for a city-state tried to manage a world system. That mismatch can be felt in the recurring crises of the 2nd century BC. Military command brought extraordinary prestige. Wealth distorted elections. Provincial administration tempted predation. Popular unrest simmered. Allied communities in Italy bore heavy burdens but still lacked full citizenship. The Senate defended its authority, but often with short-sighted arrogance. The assemblies still expressed the people's sovereignty in theory, but in practice, they were vulnerable to manipulation, patronage, and urban crowd dynamics. Rome was not yet collapsing, but the foundations were beginning to strain, And yet, it is important not to tell this part of the story as if decline were already inevitable. The Roman Republic remained astonishingly capable. Its military machine was formidable. Its aristocracy still produced disciplined, ambitious leaders. Its institutions still commanded loyalty. Roman law, religion, and public ritual continued to give the state legitimacy. The very fact that Rome could govern such an expanding sphere at all was remarkable. What makes this era so compelling is that triumph and danger were growing together. Every victory increased Rome's glory and sharpened its contradictions. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Mediterranean increasingly revolved around Rome. Kings sought Roman favor. Cities appealed to Roman arbitration. Traders moved through networks stabilized, however brutally, by Roman force. Cultural exchange intensified. Wealth accumulated. So did resentment. The Republic stood at the height of its prestige, but beneath that prestige lay questions it had not yet answered. Who truly benefited from empire? How could Rome govern fairly what it had won violently? Could the smallholder citizen survive the economics of conquest? Could the Senate restrain its own greed? Could Italy remain merely subordinate when it provided so much of Rome's blood and strength? Could a republic built to hate kings endure the rise of men whose individual prestige began to rival the state? Those questions would soon explode into open conflict. Reformers would emerge, so would reactionaries. Brothers would try to use the people against the Senate, and the Senate would answer with blood. Generals would discover that armies could belong more to commanders than to the Republic. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but the next and most dangerous battlefield would be Rome itself. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had become something its ancestors would barely recognize. It still called itself a republic. It still elected magistrates, consulted the Senate, and performed the rituals of civic life that had defined it for generations. But beneath that familiar surface, the balance that had once held Roman society together was beginning to fracture. The expansion that had brought Rome wealth, prestige, and security had also created pressures that its institutions were not designed to withstand. The old system had been built for a city and its surrounding lands. Now it strained under the weight of an empire. At the center of this tension stood the question of land. For centuries, Roman identity had been tied to the image of the citizen farmer. These were men who worked their own fields, served in the army when called, and returned home to their land after campaigns. This ideal was never perfectly true, but it had enough reality to shape Roman values. It gave the Republic a sense of moral grounding. The farmer-soldier was disciplined, self-reliant, and invested in the state. He fought not only for glory, but for his home. But long wars overseas had begun to erode that system. Campaigns in Spain, Greece, and beyond could last for years. Small farmers, absent for extended periods, often returned to find their land neglected, in debt, or absorbed by wealthier neighbors. At the same time, aristocrats and equestrians were buying up large tracts of land and turning them into vast estates. These estates were increasingly worked by enslaved labor, captured in Rome's many wars. Slaves could be driven harder, paid nothing, and replaced easily. The economics were brutally efficient. The result was a slow transformation of the Italian countryside. The independent farmer did not disappear overnight, but his position weakened. In his place, large estates expanded, and a growing number of displaced citizens drifted toward Rome itself. The city began to fill with men who still held citizenship, but lacked stable livelihoods. They became politically significant because their votes mattered in the assemblies, but economically vulnerable because they depended increasingly on patronage, occasional work, or state support. At the same time, Rome's Italian allies, communities that had fought alongside Rome for generations, were beginning to feel the strain of inequality. They provided soldiers, paid costs, and shared in the burdens of empire. Yet they did not enjoy full Roman citizenship. Their loyalty had been a cornerstone of Rome's rise, but now that rise made their subordinate status more difficult to accept. Into this unstable environment stepped Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. Tiberius was not an outsider or a radical in the modern sense. He came from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His father had been a respected statesman. His mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the hero of the Second Punic War. Tiberius had served in the military and had seen firsthand the conditions in parts of Italy. According to later accounts, he was struck by the decline of small farmers and the dominance of large estates worked by slaves. Whether this realization came suddenly or gradually, it led him toward a political path that would shake the Republic. In 133 BC, Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs. The office gave him the authority to propose legislation and to protect the interests of the people. He used it to introduce a land reform law aimed at redistributing public land that technically belonged to the Roman state, but had long been occupied by wealthy individuals beyond legal limits. His proposal sought to enforce those limits, reclaim excess land, and redistribute it to poorer citizens in small plots. The idea was not entirely new. Laws restricting the use of public land had existed before, but they had been ignored or weakly enforced. What made Tiberius different was his determination to act. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The senatorial elite saw the proposal as a direct threat to their economic interests and social dominance. Land was wealth, status, and power. To take it away, even under the justification of restoring legal limits, felt like an attack on the very structure of aristocratic Rome. Conflict quickly escalated. Another tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed Tiberius's proposal. In response, Tiberius took an extraordinary step. He appealed directly to the popular assembly and had Octavius removed from office. This action was deeply controversial. The tribunate was supposed to be sacrosanct. Removing a fellow tribune undermined a long-standing political norm. Tiberius justified it as necessary to serve the people's will, but to his opponents it looked like a dangerous precedent. The land law eventually passed, and a commission was established to oversee its implementation. But the political damage had already been done. Tiberius had shown that a determined leader could bypass the Senate and appeal directly to the people. He had challenged not only specific interests, but the unwritten rules that governed Roman political life. Tensions reached a breaking point when Tiberius sought re-election as tribune, something that, while not strictly illegal, was highly unusual and seen as a sign of dangerous ambition. His opponents accused him of aiming at tyranny, of seeking power beyond the limits of the Republic. On the day of the vote, violence erupted. In one of the most shocking moments in Roman political history, a group of senators and their supporters, led by the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica, attacked Tiberius and his followers. Clubs, benches, and whatever weapons could be found were used. Tiberius was killed, along with many of his supporters. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. This was not a battlefield. It was not a foreign war. It was political violence within Rome itself, carried out by members of its own ruling class against a tribune of the people. Something fundamental had changed. The Republic had experienced conflict before, but this was different. The boundary between political disagreement and physical force had been crossed in a way that could not easily be undone. For a time, it seemed as though the crisis might fade. The Land Commission continued its work, though under pressure. The Senate reasserted control, but the deeper issues remained unresolved. Inequality persisted. The Italian allies still lacked full rights. The precedent of violence lingered. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, would take up the cause. Gaius was a different kind of figure. If Tiberius had been driven by a sense of moral urgency, Gaius combined that urgency with a broader political vision and greater rhetorical skill. He was an extraordinary speaker, capable of moving crowds and shaping opinion. When he became tribune in 123 BC, he did not focus on a single reform, but introduced a wide-ranging program. He renewed and expanded the land reforms. He introduced a grain law that provided subsidized grain to Roman citizens, addressing urban poverty and securing political support. He proposed judicial reforms that shifted power in certain courts away from senators and toward the equestrian class, creating a new political balance. He promoted infrastructure projects, including roads, which provided employment and strengthened Rome's administrative network. Perhaps most controversially, Gaius proposed extending Roman citizenship to the Italian allies, or at least granting them greater rights. This was a bold attempt to address one of the most pressing tensions in the Republic. It recognized that Rome's power depended heavily on these communities, and that their continued exclusion was both unjust and dangerous. But this proposal also provoked resistance, not only from the Senate, but from many Roman citizens who feared losing their privileged status. The politics of inclusion proved as volatile as the politics of land. Like his brother, Gaius faced growing opposition. The Senate, learning from its earlier failure to stop Tiberius, adopted more subtle tactics at first, supporting rival tribunes and offering alternative proposals to divide popular support. But eventually, as tensions escalated, the conflict turned again toward violence. In 121 BC, after a series of confrontations, the Senate issued what became known as the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree urging magistrates to take whatever measures necessary to protect the state. It was, in effect, an emergency authorization that could override normal legal protections. Armed forces were mobilized within the city. Fighting broke out on the Aventine Hill. Gaius Gracchus, facing defeat, fled. According to tradition, he ordered a slave to kill him rather than be captured. Many of his supporters were hunted down and executed in the aftermath. The deaths of the Gracchi did not resolve the issues they had raised. Instead, they marked the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase of Roman politics. The use of violence, once exceptional, had become a tool that could be justified in the name of saving the Republic. But each time it was used, it weakened the norms that held the system together. The Republic had survived the challenge of the Gracchi, but it had been changed. Reform through traditional channels now seemed more difficult. The gap between rich and poor remained wide. The Italian allies were still restless. The Senate had defended its authority, but at the cost of legitimacy in the eyes of many. In the decades that followed, new figures would rise. Men who understood that power in Rome could no longer be secured only through persuasion and tradition. It could be built through armies, loyalty, and force. The path from political reform to civil war had begun, not with a single decision, but with a series of choices that slowly made violence thinkable. Rome still called itself a republic. It still believed in its laws, its customs, and its ancestral virtues. But something quieter and more dangerous had taken root beneath those beliefs. The rules had been broken once. They could be broken again, and next time, the stakes would be even higher. The century that followed the deaths of the Gracchi did not destroy the Roman Republic all at once. It weakened it in stages, through habits of fear, ambition, emergency, and revenge. Rome still had elections, magistrates, courts, laws, ceremonies, and the proud vocabulary of ancestral liberty. Senators still debated beneath the authority of tradition. Citizens still voted in assemblies. Generals still claimed to fight for the state. But the substance beneath these forms was shifting. The Republic was becoming a place where institutions remained visible, even as power increasingly flowed through personal loyalty, military command, and force. What the Gracchi had revealed was that reform could provoke bloodshed. What came next revealed that entire armies could become instruments in struggles not only against foreign enemies, but against Rome itself. The first great figure of this new age was Gaius Marius. He was not a member of the oldest Roman aristocracy, and that mattered. Roman politics had long been dominated by a relatively narrow circle of noble families whose ancestors had filled the highest offices of the Republic. Marius came from Arpinum, a town outside Rome, and though he was not poor, he was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, the first of his family to rise to the consulship. His career embodied both the possibility and the tension of late Republican politics. Rome had become powerful enough to reward talent from beyond its traditional core, but the old elite did not easily surrender prestige to outsiders. Marius first rose to major prominence during the war against Jugurtha, king of Numidia in North Africa. Jugurtha was a clever and dangerous opponent, but the war also exposed something deeply corrosive about Roman public life. Roman commanders and senators had proved vulnerable to bribery, delay, and incompetence. Jugurtha reportedly remarked that Rome was a city for sale if it could only find a buyer. Whether those exact words were spoken or polished by later writers, they captured the mood of scandal that surrounded the conflict. Marius presented himself as an alternative to aristocratic failure, a harder, cleaner, more capable commander who would finish the war where noble incompetence had dragged it on. He succeeded. With the assistance of his subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who would later become his bitter enemy, Marius helped bring the Jugurthine War to an end. That alone would have made him important, but far greater dangers were approaching from the north. Around the turn of the 2nd to the 1st century BC, Rome faced the migrating Cimbri and Teutones, peoples from beyond the traditional northern frontiers, whose movements sent shockwaves across the Roman world. Roman armies suffered severe defeats against them, culminating in catastrophe at Arausio in 105 BC. The scale of the disaster terrified Rome. Memories of the Gallic sack centuries earlier still lingered in the Roman imagination. The idea that northern barbarians could sweep into Italy and overwhelm Roman arms carried an almost primal dread. In this emergency, Marius was entrusted with repeated consulships, an extraordinary concentration of office that stretched republican custom. He reorganized and trained the army with relentless discipline. Ancient tradition associates Marius with reforms that changed the character of Roman military service, though the exact scope and timing of those reforms remain debated by historians. What matters for the story is the broader transformation. The Roman army increasingly drew from poorer citizens who had little property, and military service became less a temporary duty of landowning farmers and more a profession and pathway. Soldiers looked to commanders for pay, booty, land, and future settlement. The state still existed above them in theory, but in lived experience, a successful general could become the focal point of their hopes. Marius defeated the Teutones at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC and the Cimbri at Vercellae in 101 BC. These were major victories, and Rome celebrated him as the savior of Italy. His prestige became immense, yet the Republic paid a price for needing saviors. Every emergency made exceptional command more acceptable. Every exception made the old limits of office less secure. At the same time, another unresolved question was reaching its breaking point: the place of Rome's Italian allies. For generations, these communities had fought alongside Rome, supplied manpower, and shared in the burdens of expansion. But they still lacked full Roman citizenship. Their exclusion had become impossible to justify morally and dangerous to maintain politically. Efforts to address it had repeatedly failed. In 91 BC, after the assassination of the reforming tribune Marcus Livius Drusus, many allied communities revolted. The result was the Social War, fought from 91 to 88 BC. The name can mislead modern ears. It does not mean a war about society in the modern sense, but a war involving Rome's soci, its allies. The revolt was one of the gravest crises the Republic had yet faced. The enemies were not distant foreigners, but Italians who had marched with Rome for generations and now turned Roman methods against Rome itself. They organized, fielded armies, minted coins, and even established a capital at Corfinium, renamed Italia. That choice of name carried enormous symbolic power. The rebels were not rejecting the Roman world entirely. They were claiming a place within it, or perhaps claiming that they represented a truer political future for the peninsula than Rome's narrow oligarchy did. The war was brutal, and Rome did not defeat the Allies by force alone. It also conceded what had long been denied. Through a series of laws, Rome gradually extended citizenship to many Italian communities that laid down arms or remained loyal. This was a transformative moment. The Roman state expanded not just territorially, but politically. Italy became more fully Roman in law, and Rome became more Italian in composition. Yet even in success, the settlement introduced new strains. Incorporating vast new citizen populations raised questions about representation, voting, and political integration that the republican system handled imperfectly. Once again, Rome solved a crisis in a way that preserved the state while making it larger and harder to govern. It was in the aftermath of the social war that the rivalry between Marius and Sulla exploded into open political and military conflict. Sulla, like Marius, had risen through talent and war, but he came from a patrician family fallen on leaner times. He was brilliant, cold, ambitious, and fiercely conscious of honor. During the Jugurthine War, he had played a key role in securing Jugurtha's capture, something that both men and their supporters remembered differently. Tension between them had simmered for years. It now found its ignition in the east. A new and formidable enemy had emerged there, Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus. He was one of the most extraordinary opponents Rome ever faced. Intelligent, ruthless, multilingual, theatrical, and determined to resist Roman encroachment in Asia Minor and the Greek world. In 88 BC, amid widespread resentment of Roman financial exploitation in the east, Mithridates launched a dramatic offensive. During this upheaval, tens of thousands of Romans and Italians in Asia were killed in coordinated massacres, an event that horrified Rome and turned the war into a struggle not only for power, but for vengeance. The command against Mithridates was given to Sulla, but Marius, old now yet still hungry for glory, maneuvered through political allies in Rome to have the command transferred to himself. At this point, something happened that no Roman before had done. Sulla marched his army on Rome. The enormity of that act is difficult to overstate. Roman armies were not supposed to enter the city as instruments of personal political will. They were raised for war abroad, for the defense and expansion of the state. By bringing armed legions against Rome itself, Sulla shattered one of the deepest assumptions of republican life. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean now saw its own sacred boundaries violated by its own citizens in arms. Sulla seized Rome, reversed the political decisions against him, and restored his command. Marius fled. Then Sulla departed east to wage war against Mithridates, leaving behind a city whose political order had been irreparably damaged. The precedent was set. A Roman general with a loyal army could use force not only to defeat external enemies, but to settle disputes at the center of the Republic. While Sulla campaigned in the east, Rome again descended into factional violence. Marius returned and allied with Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Together, they took control of the city in 87 BC. Their return was accompanied by bloodshed and revenge. Political enemies were hunted down and killed. Marius, having achieved a 7th consulship, died shortly afterward in 86 BC, leaving behind a legacy of military glory and constitutional distortion. He had saved Rome from foreign danger, but he had also helped create a political world in which force increasingly spoke louder than law. Sulla, meanwhile, defeated Mithridates' forces in Greece and Asia Minor and negotiated a settlement that allowed him to return west. In 83 BC, he landed in Italy, with battle-hardened troops. What followed was a full-scale civil war. Roman fought Roman across the peninsula. Old loyalties fractured. Ambitious young men chose sides and began the careers that would shape the next generation. Among those who emerged in Sulla's orbit were Pompey and Crassus, names that would dominate later struggles. Sulla won. In 82 BC, after defeating his enemies and taking Rome, he made himself dictator, not for the traditional brief emergency term of earlier republican practice, but for an open-ended mission to restore the republic. The irony was immense. A man who had marched on Rome and won a civil war now claimed extraordinary personal power in order to save constitutional order. His dictatorship was one of terror as much as legislation. Sulla published proscription lists, naming enemies of the state who could be killed with impunity. Their property was confiscated. Their descendants were stigmatized. Heads were displayed in public. Personal vendettas, greed, and fear mingled with ideological justification. The proscriptions were not simply political executions. They were a system of legalized murder and confiscation that enriched supporters and terrorized society. The Republic had seen violence before, but this was organized, bureaucratic bloodshed. And yet Sulla did not rule only through fear. He also attempted a constitutional settlement. He strengthened the Senate, weakened the tribunate, restricted the power of popular politics, and sought to formalize the cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices. In his mind, or at least in his public claim, he was restoring oligarchic stability, curbing dangerous demagogues, and reasserting senatorial government. But here lay the fatal contradiction. A constitution imposed by military dictatorship was already compromised at its core. Sulla could legislate forms, but he could not restore trust in unwritten norms once his own career had proved how fragile those norms were. In 79 BC, astonishingly, Sulla resigned the dictatorship and retired from public life. Ancient observers were amazed. He had seized supreme power and then laid it down. In one sense, this seemed to validate his claim that he had not wanted kingship for its own sake. In another sense, it only deepened the damage. The Republic had now seen that one man could take the state by force, rewrite its institutions, kill his enemies, then step aside and leave the memory behind as a precedent waiting to be reused. The years after Sulla were calmer only by comparison. The deeper sickness remained. His settlement satisfied no one permanently. The tribunate recovered some of its power. Popular politics revived. Ambitious generals continued to seek extraordinary commands. Provincial exploitation continued. In Spain, Quintus Sertorius led a long resistance against the Sullan order, showing that even far from Rome, civil war's embers still burned. In the east, Mithridates remained troublesome. Piracy spread across the Mediterranean, threatening trade and grain supply. Slavery, which underpinned so much of Roman wealth, erupted into one of the most famous revolts in ancient history. That revolt was led by Spartacus. Beginning in 73 BC, as an escape of gladiators from a training school in Capua, it became a massive uprising that shook Italy for 2 years. Enslaved men and women, joined by others on the margins of Roman society, moved through the countryside, defeating Roman forces and swelling in number. Their aims remain difficult to reconstruct. Ancient sources, written by Roman elites, do not preserve the rebels' own voice clearly. But whatever Spartacus intended, The revolt exposed the scale of the enslaved population in Italy and the latent violence embedded in the Roman social order. Rome eventually crushed the rebellion under Marcus Licinius Crassus. Thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies displayed as a warning. Roman authority was restored, but once again it was restored through spectacle and terror. By the 70s and 60s BC, two towering figures had risen, Pompey and Crassus. Pompey, still young, had gained fame through military success and cultivated an image of almost princely grandeur. Crassus, immensely wealthy, wielded influence through money as well as force. Both had supported Sulla, yet both also maneuvered beyond the framework he had left behind. In 70 BC, they were elected consuls and began dismantling parts of Sulla's constitutional order. This too reveals the instability of the time. Even victors of one settlement had incentives to unmake it when advantage required. Pompey in particular became the model of the late Republican strongman. He received extraordinary commands on an extraordinary scale. In 67 BC, he was given sweeping authority to clear the Mediterranean of pirates. He did so with remarkable speed. In 66 BC, through the Lex Manilia, he received command against Mithridates and reorganized the East after victory. He subdued kingdoms, founded cities, settled provinces, and returned to Rome with immense prestige. His eastern settlements reshaped the Roman world. He looked, in many ways, like the most powerful man in the Republic. And yet, that was precisely the problem. The Republic had no stable mechanism for handling men of such scale. Pompey wanted recognition for his settlements and land for his veterans. The Senate hesitated, delayed, maneuvered, and mistrusted him. Crassus sought opportunities of his own. Other ambitious men watched closely. Among them was Julius Caesar. Caesar was younger than Pompey and Crassus, but already marked by political daring, aristocratic pedigree, charm, debt, and ambition of unusual intensity. He had survived the Sullan era by navigating danger carefully. He possessed the noble ancestry that Marius had lacked, but he also had a populist instinct and a gift for winning loyalty. He understood spectacle, language, and timing. He also understood something essential about the late Republic. No one could dominate it alone without allies, but alliances between powerful men would always be unstable because the system itself no longer offered enough room for them all. In 60 BC, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed an informal political alliance that modern historians call the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office, but it was more powerful than many official structures. Pompey had military prestige, Crassus had immense wealth, and Caesar had political energy and strategic intelligence. Together, they could bypass senatorial resistance and divide influence among themselves. This arrangement was a symptom of constitutional failure. The Republic still existed, but crucial decisions were increasingly made not through balanced institutions, but through bargains among dominant individuals. Caesar became consul in 59 BC, and soon afterward received command in Gaul. What followed would transform him from a rising statesman into a figure impossible for the Republic to contain. Over the next years, he conquered vast territories, extended Roman rule to the Atlantic, bridged the Rhine, invaded Britain, and built a battle-hardened army fiercely loyal to him. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written with brilliant self-presentation, turned military reports into political art. He appeared before the Roman public not merely as a commander, but as the architect of glory itself. Meanwhile, the alliance that had sustained the balance among great men began to fray. Caesar's daughter Julia, who had married Pompey and helped bind the partnership, died in 54 BC. Crassus sought military glory against Parthia, but was disastrously defeated and killed at Carrhae in 53 BC. His death removed the third weight from the political scale. What remained was a rivalry that could no longer be managed. Caesar in Gaul with his army and prestige, Pompey in Rome increasingly drawn toward the senatorial establishment that feared Caesar's return. By this point, the Republic was living on borrowed time. Its forms still operated. Offices were filled, speeches were given, elections were held. But everyone who mattered knew that the real question was no longer merely legal. It was whether Caesar would be allowed to return as a private citizen vulnerable to prosecution, or whether he would insist on retaining the protection of command and office. Behind that legal dispute stood armies, clients, ambitions, and years of accumulated mistrust. Rome had entered the age in which generals made and unmade the state. The farmer-soldier republic of old memory was now a Mediterranean empire held together by legions whose loyalty could be personal, by provinces that enriched the few, by crowds that could be swayed, and by elites who invoked liberty even while preparing for civil war. Marius and Sulla had shown that armies could decide politics. Pompey and Caesar were about to prove that once such a lesson is learned, it is never easily forgotten. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he did more than lead an army over a small river in northern Italy. He crossed the line that separated political rivalry from open civil war. And with that act, the Roman Republic entered its final crisis. The river itself was not grand. It did not have the majesty of the Nile or the breadth of the Danube. But in Roman political life, it marked a boundary, and Caesar's decision to bring armed force across it into Italy carried a message no citizen could misunderstand. He was no longer negotiating within the rules of the Republic. He was compelling the Republic to answer him under the shadow of his legions. The conflict had been building for years. Caesar's victories in Gaul had made him too successful to be harmless. Pompey's prestige, once unmatched, had become threatened by Caesar's growing fame. The Senate, or at least the faction within it hostile to Caesar, feared what would happen if he returned to Rome with political momentum and the loyalty of battle-hardened troops behind his name. Caesar, for his part, knew that laying down command without guarantees would expose him to prosecution and political ruin. The dispute was framed in constitutional language, and it truly was constitutional in one sense, but underneath it was something older and more dangerous: the unwillingness of powerful men to submit to uncertainty once they had grown accustomed to greatness. Pompey and many senators fled Rome rather than fight immediately in Italy. This decision has often looked surprising to later observers. Pompey had resources, reputation, and legitimacy on his side, yet he withdrew to the east, where he could gather stronger forces from the provinces and allied kings. Caesar entered Rome not as a sacker of cities, but as a Roman commander claiming to rescue the Republic from corrupt enemies. He moved quickly, seized the treasury, and pursued the war on multiple fronts. Spain, Greece, Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean all became theaters in a conflict that was no longer merely political but imperial in scale. The Civil War revealed the full reach of Roman power because Rome's empire became the battleground on which Romans fought each other. Provinces supplied ships, grain, taxes, and soldiers to competing claimants. Cities had to choose sides or endure occupation. Kings calculated which Roman master might prevail. The Republic was no longer a city commanding the Mediterranean. It was a Mediterranean system tearing itself apart. Caesar moved first against Pompeian forces in Spain, neutralizing them with speed and skill. Then he turned east. In 48 BC, the decisive confrontation came at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey had assembled a large army, and many of the most distinguished senatorial leaders were with him. In theory, his cause carried the dignity of legitimacy. He was defending the established order against a rebel. But legitimacy on paper could not guarantee victory in the field. Caesar's army, though smaller, was more experienced, more cohesive, and bound to him by years of shared hardship and reward. At Pharsalus, Caesar won. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping perhaps to find shelter or strategic advantage there. Instead, he met a miserable end. The courtiers of the young King Ptolemy XIII, hoping to ingratiate themselves with Caesar, murdered Pompey upon his arrival and cut off his head. When Caesar reached Egypt and was presented with that grisly offering, he is said to have reacted with grief or disgust. Whether the gesture was sincere, politically useful, or both, Pompey's death symbolized something more than the fall of a rival. It marked the end of one of the last men who could have plausibly balanced Caesar within the old republican world. A great Roman had not fallen in honorable battle before his peers. He had been butchered by foreign hands while seeking refuge, and the Republic's decline felt smaller and sadder in that moment. Caesar's arrival in Egypt drew him into a dynastic struggle between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra has often been remembered through the haze of romance and later legend, but she was above all an intelligent and politically formidable ruler, trying to preserve her kingdom in a world dominated by Roman power. Caesar supported her cause. During the Alexandrian War, he found himself fighting amid the city's dangerous streets, harbor, and palaces. Ancient accounts connect this conflict with a fire that may have damaged parts of the famed Library of Alexandria, though the scale and exact nature of that loss remain debated. Cleopatra emerged as queen with Caesar's backing, and she became his lover. Their relationship had enormous symbolic importance. Caesar, the most powerful Roman of his age, was now associated with the ancient wealth and monarchical splendor of Egypt. To some Romans, this fed suspicions already gathering around him, that he was no mere magistrate or general, but a man drifting toward kingship in all but name. Rome hated kings in memory, but it had grown dangerously accustomed to men with king-like power. Caesar still had enemies to defeat. He moved with his usual relentless energy. In Pontus, he crushed Pharnaces, son of Mithridates, and announced the victory in the famous phrase, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Then he turned west and south again. In Africa, he defeated the remaining Pompeian forces at Thapsus in 46 BC. Cato the Younger, perhaps the purest senatorial defender of republican principle, chose suicide rather than submit. Cato's death mattered because he had become a moral symbol. Whatever practical weaknesses the senatorial cause had displayed, Cato represented its ideal of incorruptible resistance to tyranny. By dying on his own terms, he denied Caesar the triumph of pardon and gave later generations a martyr of liberty. The war did not end there. In Spain, Caesar faced one final major challenge from Pompey's sons. At Munda, in 45 BC, he won again, though the battle was hard fought. By then, there was no rival left who could seriously challenge him. Caesar had defeated the Republic's defenders, or at least those who claimed to defend it, on every major front. He returned to Rome, master of the Roman world. Now came the most delicate question of all. What does a republic do with a man who has no equal? Caesar did not abolish republican forms outright. That would have been too blunt, and perhaps even he did not imagine his power in so simple a form. Offices still existed. The Senate still met. Elections still occurred, though under conditions shaped by his dominance. But honors and powers accumulated around him at a rate that alarmed many observers. He was appointed dictator repeatedly, then dictator for 10 years, and finally dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Statues were raised. His image appeared in public places with unprecedented emphasis. He wore triumphal dress on ceremonial occasions. His chair in the Senate, his bodyguards, his public cultic associations, all suggested a status beyond any ordinary magistrate. Caesar also pursued reforms, and some of them were serious and necessary. He restructured debt in limited ways, settled veterans, founded colonies, enlarged the Senate, revised the calendar, and planned administrative measures for governing a wider empire more rationally. The Julian calendar was one of his most enduring achievements, bringing order to the Roman system of timekeeping. He appears to have understood that the old republican machinery was inadequate for the scale of Roman rule. In that sense, he was not merely ambitious. He was responding to real structural problems, but even useful reforms can become threatening when they are inseparable from one man's supremacy. Caesar's enlargement of the Senate, for example, may have aimed at broader representation and loyalty, but to old aristocrats, it also diluted the body's prestige by filling it with his supporters and provincial elites. His clemency toward defeated enemies won admiration in some quarters, but it also created a humiliating relationship in which noble Romans lived by the mercy of the man who had defeated them. Clemency sounds generous, yet for a proud aristocracy, it could feel like domination in softened form. Then there was the question of kingship, the most toxic word in Roman politics. Caesar seems not to have called himself king in Rome, though the title may have been contemplated for rule outside Italy or floated by supporters in ambiguous ways. At the festival of the Lupercalia in 44 BC, Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a diadem, the symbol of monarchy. Caesar refused it, but the scene itself was dangerous. Whether staged, spontaneous, or politically misjudged, it allowed Romans to imagine the possibility that Caesar either wanted kingship or wished to test the public reaction. In a society whose founding legend defined liberty against kings, that was enough to sharpen fear. A conspiracy formed among senators, including men Caesar had pardoned. Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestry was linked by tradition to the very Brutus who expelled the kings, joined the plot, giving it immense symbolic force. Gaius Cassius Longinus and others believed, or told themselves, that by killing Caesar, they would save the Republic. It is easy to see the nobility of that language. It is also necessary to see its blindness. The Republic they hoped to restore had already been shattered by decades of civil war, military politics, and constitutional decay. Caesar was not the sole cause of that crisis. He was its culmination. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate meeting at the theatre of Pompey. There, surrounded by conspirators, he was stabbed to death. Ancient accounts differ in detail, and many later embellishments have attached themselves to the scene. But the essential fact is stark enough. The most powerful Roman in the world was cut down by fellow senators in a political murder intended to restore liberty. Instead, the assassination unleashed chaos. The conspirators had a slogan, but not a workable plan. They had killed the man, but not mastered the consequences. Caesar's supporters remained powerful. The people of Rome did not rise in celebration of senatorial freedom, and the army had not disappeared simply because its commander was dead. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and consul, maneuvered quickly. At Caesar's funeral, public emotion was inflamed, especially when his wounds and will were displayed. The crowd turned hostile to the assassins. Brutus and Cassius were eventually forced to leave the city. Then a new figure entered the struggle: Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, known to history as Octavian and later as Augustus. He was only 18 when Caesar died, and many older men underestimated him. That would prove one of the most consequential misjudgments in Roman history. Octavian had neither Antony's military reputation nor Caesar's seasoned charisma, but he possessed an extraordinary combination of patience, calculation, emotional control, and political instinct. He understood that in the post-Caesarian world, legitimacy mattered, and Caesar's name gave him a claim no one else could match. By adopting the identity of Caesar's son and avenger, he stepped at once into the center of Roman politics. At first, the situation remained fluid. Antony sought to control Caesar's legacy. The Senate, led in part by Cicero, hoped to use Octavian against Antony and preserve some version of republican balance. Cicero, the greatest orator of his age, launched a fierce series of speeches, the Philippics, attacking Antony as a threat to liberty. For a moment it seemed possible that the assassin's cause might be transformed into a wider senatorial recovery through shifting alliances. But this hope depended on the assumption that ambitious men could be manipulated without becoming masters themselves. Rome had already learned that lesson more than once, and it was learning it again. In 43 BC, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, an official three-man board with extraordinary powers to restore the state. The phrase was almost laughably pious beside the reality. This was not restoration, but division of power among warlords. Unlike the earlier informal alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this triumvirate was legally constituted and brutally effective. Its first great act was terror. Proscriptions returned. The memory of Sulla now came roaring back. Enemies were listed, hunted, and killed. Property was confiscated. Cicero, who had hoped to save the Republic with speech, was murdered. His head and hands were displayed in the Forum. The image is almost unbearable in its symbolic cruelty. The greatest voice of Republican eloquence was silenced and exhibited by a regime that claimed necessity while destroying the last dignity of lawful politics. Brutus and Cassius gathered forces in the east, presenting themselves as liberators against tyranny. In 42 BC, at the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia, the triumvirs defeated them. Brutus and Cassius both died by suicide. With them died the last serious military hope of restoring the old republic by force. But Rome still had not found peace. The victors soon turned on one another, as such alliances nearly always do. Lepidus faded into political irrelevance. Antony took the east, where he became increasingly associated with Cleopatra and the court of Egypt. Their relationship, political and romantic, became one of the most famous in history, though in Roman politics it mattered above all as propaganda material. Octavian, in the West, crafted a very different image. He presented himself as the defender of Italy, Roman tradition, and lawful order against Antony's supposed corruption by Eastern luxury and monarchical decadence. The conflict between Antony and Octavian was not simply a private rivalry. It was a struggle over what Rome would become. Antony had prestige, military skill, and the glamour of Caesar's memory. Cleopatra offered him wealth, fleet power, and dynastic possibility. But Octavian controlled the language of legitimacy more effectively. He understood Roman fears and resentments. He turned Antony's alliance with Cleopatra into evidence that Antony had betrayed Roman identity itself. In 31 BC, the final showdown came at Actium, a naval battle off the coast of western Greece. Octavian's forces, commanded by Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The battle was decisive less because of the immediate casualties than because it destroyed the political future of Antony's cause. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives. Egypt, one of the richest and oldest kingdoms in the Mediterranean, became Octavian's possession and then effectively a Roman domain under his personal control. At this point, there was no one left. The long age of civil wars that had begun, in one sense, with the violence of the Gracchi and intensified through Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, had ended in the victory of a single man. But Octavian had learned from the fate of Caesar. Raw supremacy was not enough. Rome would not accept a king by name, and even dictatorship had become too exposed a symbol of domination. If one man was to rule the Roman world securely, he would need to rule through forms the Roman mind could tolerate. He would need to preserve the appearance of the Republic while absorbing its substance. That task would define the next chapter of Roman history, and perhaps the most brilliant political transformation in the ancient world. The Republic had not been saved by Caesar's murder. It had been exhausted, by the struggle that followed. Out of its ruins, Octavian would build something new, something careful, durable, and deceptive in equal measure. A monarchy that refused to call itself monarchy. An empire draped in republican language. A system in which Rome would still speak of liberty even as it learned to live under emperors. When Octavian emerged victorious after Actium and the fall of Egypt, the Roman world had been conquered once again, this time not by a foreign enemy, but by one Roman over all others. Yet victory alone did not solve the problem of rule. The Republic had collapsed into civil war because no one could any longer contain the ambitions of its greatest men within its old political forms. Julius Caesar had shown that open dominance could be won, but his assassination had shown that naked supremacy was also vulnerable. Octavian understood what Caesar, for all his brilliance, had not fully mastered. Rome would accept almost any reality, provided that reality was named carefully enough. The Roman hatred of kingship still lived in memory and language, even after the substance of republican liberty had been hollowed out by generations of violence. If Rome was to be governed by one man, that man could not appear as a king. He had to appear as the restorer of the Republic, the servant of the state, the first citizen among citizens. And so Octavian, who would become Augustus, built one of the most successful political settlements in history. A monarchy disguised as a republic, an empire founded not on the abolition of Roman tradition, but on its careful preservation as theatre, ritual, and cloak. In 27 BC, after years of maneuver, Octavian staged a formal return of powers to the Senate and people of Rome. The gesture was theatrical, but not empty. It allowed him to present himself as modest, dutiful, and reluctant to dominate. The Senate, in turn, begged him to retain authority for the good of the state. In this exchange, a new order was born. Octavian received the name Augustus, a title rich with religious and moral resonance, suggesting elevation, reverence, and destiny. He did not call himself king. He did not even make emperor his personal name in the later sense. The title imperator, originally a military acclamation, became part of his identity, but his most revealing label was princeps, first citizen. This was the essence of the Augustan solution. Rome could keep the language of citizenship while accepting the reality of hierarchy. The settlement of 27 BC and the refinements that followed in 23 BC and later gave Augustus a bundle of powers rather than a single crowned office. He held imperium, supreme military command, over key provinces where most armies were stationed. He possessed tribunician power, granting him sacrosanctity and legislative initiative. He exercised enormous influence over elections, appointments, and legislation. He was not every magistrate at once, but he could overshadow all magistrates. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected. Assemblies still existed. But none of these institutions could seriously govern against the will of Augustus. The genius of the system lay precisely here. It did not ask Romans to admit that the Republic was gone. It invited them to believe that the Republic had been healed, stabilized, and quietly guided by the one man strong enough to save it from itself. This was not pure cynicism. Augustus truly did bring peace after a century of recurrent civil conflict. The Romans called it pax, peace, But that word did not mean softness or equality. It meant order after chaos, obedience after rivalry, and the absence of civil slaughter within a world still held together by military force. For many Romans and provincials alike, this was no small gift. The memory of proscriptions, confiscations, sieges, and armies marching through Italy was fresh. If one man could prevent that from happening again, many were willing to accept his supremacy, especially if he wrapped it in legality, modesty, and ancestral religion. Augustus understood that ruling Rome required more than institutions. It required imagination. He had to teach Romans how to feel about the new order. He did this through symbols, buildings, moral language, literature, and time itself. He famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The phrase captures more than architectural vanity. Augustus rebuilt Rome physically to express political renewal. Temples were restored, monuments rose. The Forum of Augustus linked his regime to Rome's martial and ancestral past. The Ara Pacis, the altar of Augustan peace, depicted the imperial family and a vision of prosperity, fertility, and sacred order. These were not just decorations, they were arguments in stone. Religion also became central to his program. Augustus revived old cults, repaired neglected shrines, and presented himself as the guardian of Roman piety. Civil war had not only killed people, it had also seemed to fracture the cosmic order. The gods had to be reconciled. The city had to be purified and morally disciplined. Augustus promoted marriage laws, condemned adultery, and spoke often of ancestral virtues, though his own household would eventually reveal how difficult it was to legislate morality even from the summit of power. Still, his message was clear. The new regime was not a revolution against Roman tradition. It was a restoration of old virtues in a new political form. Literature played a profound role in shaping this vision. The Augustan age produced some of the greatest writers in Latin history. Virgil, Horace, Livy, and Ovid each, in very different ways, responded to the reality of Augustus. Virgil's Aeneid became the great national epic Rome had never before fully possessed. It traced Roman origins back to Troy through Aeneas, but it also gave cosmic meaning to Augustan rule. Rome's suffering, wandering, war, and destiny all culminated in an empire of order, and Augustus stood at the end of that chain as its providential heir. Yet the Aeneid is too great a poem to be reduced to propaganda. It also contains sorrow, violence, and the sense that empire is purchased through irreparable loss. That complexity is part of what makes it enduring. Even in its celebration of destiny, it cannot entirely forget blood. Horace, more intimate and reflective, offered a different texture to the age, often praising peace, proportion, and cultivated retreat after decades of disorder. Livy wrote Rome's history from its legendary beginnings, creating a moral mirror in which Romans could contemplate the virtues and failings that had made them. Ovid, playful, brilliant, and less obedient than Augustus might have liked, eventually ran afoul of the regime and was exiled, a reminder that the princeps could tolerate art only up to a point. The Augustan peace had room for beauty, but not for unlimited freedom. Beyond Rome itself, Augustus reorganized the empire with remarkable care. Provinces were divided into senatorial and imperial categories. The distinction was politically elegant and practically decisive. Peaceful provinces with few troops were left under senatorial administration. Strategic provinces with major armies remained under Augustus's control. Thus, while the Senate retained dignity, the princeps held the sword. He also developed a more stable imperial bureaucracy, though still modest by later standards. Taxation became more regularized, census mechanisms improved, roads and communications were maintained. Colonies for veterans were established, not only rewarding soldiers, but also Romanizing local landscapes and extending imperial networks. The army itself underwent one of the most consequential transformations in Roman history. Under the Republic, armies had often been raised for campaigns and then disbanded, though the late Republic had already moved toward more permanent loyalties under great commanders. Augustus created a standing professional army. Legionaries now served long terms under the state, with clearer systems of pay and retirement. To help fund veteran settlements and benefits, Augustus established the Aerarium Militare, a military treasury. This mattered enormously. It reduced, though never entirely removed, the danger that soldiers would look only to individual generals for reward. The army became an institution of the imperial state, though emperors would later learn how unstable even that arrangement could be if the army ceased to love or fear them. Augustus also created the Praetorian Guard, elite troops stationed in and around Italy to protect the ruler and reinforce political control. In the short term, this was useful. In the long term, it introduced a dangerous principle into Roman politics: the concentration of privileged military force close to the center of power. Future emperors would be made and unmade by soldiers who claimed to guard them. For all the brilliance of Augustus's system, it was not a universal peace in the sense of endless tranquility. Roman expansion and military campaigning continued. In Spain, Alpine regions, the Balkans, and elsewhere, conquest or consolidation demanded force. The northern frontier remained especially uncertain. Augustus and his generals pushed Roman influence toward the Rhine and Danube, envisioning a stable frontier system in Europe. For a moment, it seemed possible that Roman rule might extend permanently deep into Germany. That dream died in AD 9, when 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic forces led by Arminius, a chieftain who had himself been trained within the Roman system. The disaster shocked Augustus deeply. Ancient writers preserve the image of the aging ruler crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." Whether the words were repeated exactly so or polished later, they capture the emotional truth. Rome was not invincible, and the forests beyond the Rhine would remain a place where imperial ambition met hard limits. The Teutoburg disaster had lasting consequences. Rome did not abandon northern warfare altogether, but it became more cautious about trying to absorb Germania fully. The Rhine and Danube hardened into more enduring frontiers. The empire, though vast, was not without edges. Augustus also faced the problem that haunts every monarchy, especially one pretending not to be a monarchy: succession. He had no legitimate son to inherit his position straightforwardly. The Roman state still had no official office called emperor, with clear hereditary rules. Everything depended on influence, adoption, marriage, prestige, and the acceptance of army and senate. Augustus spent years trying to shape succession through his family. Nephews, grandsons, stepsons, and sons-in-law were elevated, groomed, and then often died prematurely. The personal tragedies of the imperial house were not merely domestic sorrow, they were constitutional crises in waiting. Eventually, Augustus settled on Tiberius, his stepson, an able but deeply reserved and often unwilling figure. Tiberius was compelled into the dynastic plan more by necessity than by love. This too reveals the strange nature of the early principate. Rome had a ruler who denied being a king, and yet the survival of the system increasingly depended on his household. Public office had become inseparable from private blood and marriage, even while official language denied that the state belonged to a dynasty. When Augustus died in AD 14, he left behind not only a larger and more beautiful Rome, but a functioning imperial system. That may be his greatest achievement. Many men can win power. Far fewer can make power survivable after themselves. Augustus did. The Senate declared him divine after death, and Tiberius succeeded him without civil war. The transfer was delicate and perhaps not universally enthusiastic, but it worked. The Republic, in its old sense, was gone. In its place stood the Principate, durable enough to outlive its founder. Tiberius was a very different ruler. If Augustus excelled in presentation, Tiberius often seemed uncomfortable with performance. He was a capable general, an effective administrator, and not naturally foolish, but he lacked the warmth and theatrical genius that had made Augustus so successful in managing Roman opinion. Early in his reign, he governed with restraint, cooperating to some extent with the Senate and preserving the forms of the Principate. But over time, his relationship with Rome's elite worsened. Suspicion grew. Trials for treason multiplied. Fear thickened. When Tiberius withdrew increasingly from Rome to the island of Capri, government became more remote and sinister in reputation. Ancient sources, many hostile to him, paint a dark picture of his later years, though their sensationalism must be read carefully. What remains clear is that the Principate was proving emotionally and politically fragile. Even with Augustus's structures in place, the personality of the ruler mattered enormously. After Tiberius came Gaius, better known by the childhood nickname Caligula. His accession in AD 37 initially brought relief and hope. He was the son of the beloved Germanicus and appeared as a fresh, charismatic figure after the gloom of Tiberius's final years. But his reign quickly descended into a pattern ancient authors portray as madness, cruelty, theatrical humiliation of elites, and unstable self-display. It is difficult to untangle fact from senatorial hostility in the sources, and modern historians have rightly been cautious. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, Caligula's rule seems to have exposed the dangerous intimacy between the emperor's personality and the empire's stability. If the emperor could not govern himself, how could he govern the world? In AD 41, he was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard and others at court. His death revealed another truth about the empire. Rome no longer chose its ruler through republican competition. The palace, the army, and chance now mattered decisively. After Caligula's murder, his uncle Claudius was found and proclaimed emperor, reportedly in chaotic circumstances. Claudius had long been underestimated, in part because of physical disabilities and because his family had not treated him as a likely ruler. Yet once in power, he proved unexpectedly competent in many respects. He expanded the imperial bureaucracy, relied more heavily on imperial freedmen in administration, and pursued major building projects. Most famously, under Claudius Roman, forces invaded Britain in AD 43, beginning the long process of bringing much of the island under Roman control. This conquest had strategic and symbolic value. It recalled Julius Caesar's earlier expeditions, while allowing the Julio-Claudian house to add fresh glory to its name. Claudius also continued the integration of provincial elites into the empire. One revealing episode is his support for admitting Gallic nobles to the Roman Senate, a policy preserved in part through an inscription of a speech he gave. Here, the old Roman habit of incorporation remained alive at the highest level. The empire endured not only by conquest, but by widening its ruling class, though always on Roman terms. Then came Nero. Nero's reign began in AD 54, under the guidance of experienced advisors, including Seneca and Burrus. In its early years, government was relatively stable, but as Nero grew into his power, artistic self-indulgence, paranoia, dynastic violence, and strained relations with the elite came increasingly to define his rule. He murdered his mother Agrippina, eliminated rivals, and cultivated an image of himself as performer, singer, and charioteer, in ways many Romans found degrading for a ruler. The Great Fire of Rome, in AD 64, intensified both his infamy and his opportunities. Ancient tradition has often linked Nero to the fire, though direct responsibility is uncertain. What is clearer is that after the disaster he undertook major rebuilding, and that suspicion attached itself to him powerfully enough that later generations remembered him as the emperor who watched Rome burn. In the aftermath, Christians were persecuted, one of the earliest major imperial actions against the movement, though Christianity was still small and poorly understood by Roman authorities. Nero also built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous and extravagant palace complex. In doing so, he seemed to embody the fear, long latent within the principate, that the ruler might cease to be first citizen and become instead a self-indulgent monarch consuming the capital for private spectacle. By AD 68, revolts in the provinces and military defections made his position untenable. Abandoned, Nero committed suicide. With his death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the house that had ruled since Augustus. What followed was the Year of the Four Emperors, AD 68 to 69, a vivid demonstration that Rome's imperial system, for all its strength, still lacked a universally accepted succession mechanism. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each claimed power in rapid sequence, backed by different armies and regions. The legions mattered now, more openly than ever. Emperors were not simply heirs of Augustus by moral right. They were the men whom soldiers and political coalitions could raise above others. Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, emerged as the victor. He brought a practical, soldierly style after the theatrical excesses of Nero. The civil war that elevated him had once again shown how close Rome always remained to military monarchy beneath republican language. Yet, Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian also demonstrated the continuing resilience of the imperial system. The Flavians rebuilt, stabilized finances, and pursued major projects, including the amphitheater later known as the Colosseum. Titus became emperor in AD 79 and was remembered with relative affection, though his short reign was marked by disaster as well, including the eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. Domitian, by contrast, ruled more autocratically and suspiciously, increasing tensions with the elite until his assassination in AD 96. By then, however, the empire was no longer an experiment. It was the Roman world's governing reality. From Augustus onward, Rome had learned to live under emperors. It had roads, tax systems, armies, provincial administration, monumental cities, cultural exchange, and a political imagination that could still speak of Senate and people while knowing that ultimate power rested elsewhere. The fiction of restored republican liberty had gradually become less important than the lived reality of imperial order. And that order, after the turbulence of dynastic change, was about to enter the age many later Romans and historians would remember as one of its greatest periods, when emperors chosen by adoption and merit seemed to offer a more stable answer than bloodline alone. Yet even at its height, the empire carried the same questions planted at its birth. Could one man rule a world without becoming captive to the court, the army, or his own image? Could peace endure without stagnation? Could succession ever be made safe? Rome had solved the problem of republican collapse by creating emperors. It had not solved the deeper human problem that every empire eventually faces: how to preserve power without being consumed by it. By the end of the 1st century AD, Rome had done something extraordinary. It had survived the collapse of its republic, the violence of civil war, the uncertainty of dynastic succession, and the dangerous personalities of emperors who ranged from brilliant to erratic. More importantly, it had turned empire into habit. What had once been a political improvisation under Augustus was now the accepted structure of the Roman world. The Senate still existed, magistrates still held office, and citizens still spoke the old language of public life. But no one could seriously mistake where power lived. It lived in the emperor, in the court around him, and in the armies that secured his position. Yet for a time, this system seemed capable not merely of surviving, but of flourishing on a scale that made Roman rule appear almost natural, as though the Mediterranean had always been destined to revolve around one center. The 2 centuries that followed would contain Rome at its height, Rome in transformation, and Rome in slow fracture. This is where the empire reached its fullest shape, and where the seeds of its division, endurance, and fall become most visible. After the assassination of Domitian in AD 96, the empire entered a period later generations would remember with particular admiration. The Senate selected Nerva, an elderly and relatively moderate figure, as emperor. His reign was short, but his most important act was one of succession. Recognizing both his own weakness and the need for military support, he adopted the respected general Trajan as his heir. That decision helped establish a model that later Roman writers would praise: the adoption of capable successors rather than reliance on bloodline alone. The reality was never quite as pure as later nostalgia suggested, but for a time it worked remarkably well. Trajan became emperor in AD 98 and is often remembered as the ruler under whom Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. He was a soldier emperor in the best sense Roman opinion could admire, active, disciplined, visible to his troops, and ambitious without obvious theatrical excess. Under him, the empire expanded decisively in Dacia, north of the Danube, in campaigns fought from AD 101 to 106. The conquest was hard, costly, and prestigious. It brought wealth, especially in the form of access to mineral resources, and it also offered Trajan the glory of major victory. His forum in Rome, adorned with Trajan's column, preserved in carved spirals the story of these wars. The monument still stands, a stone memory of Roman military confidence. Later, Trajan campaigned in the east against Parthia, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates. He temporarily occupied Armenia, Mesopotamia, and even reached the Persian Gulf. For a moment, it seemed that Rome might rival Alexander not only in memory, but in Eastern achievement. Yet these conquests proved difficult to hold. Distance, logistics, resistance, and the sheer challenge of maintaining rule beyond sustainable lines of control revealed the limits even of a powerful emperor. The empire could still expand, but every expansion brought new burdens. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, understood this more clearly. Where Trajan symbolized the outward thrust of Roman confidence, Hadrian represented consolidation, order, and cultural breadth. He abandoned some of Trajan's eastern gains, preferring frontiers that could be defended rather than conquests that could only be advertised. Hadrian traveled widely through the empire, more than almost any emperor before him. Britain, Gaul, the Greek East, North Africa, Egypt, Asia Minor, the Danubian frontier. He moved through this immense world not simply as a distant ruler issuing commands from Rome, but as a visible presence. This mattered. It reminded provinces that the emperor's eye could fall anywhere, and it reinforced the sense that the empire, though vast, was one connected political body. In Britain, Hadrian ordered the construction of the Great Wall that still bears his name, stretching across northern England. It was not merely a barrier, it was a statement in earth and stone about what Rome was and what it was not. Beyond lay unconquered lands, shifting tribal worlds, uncertainty. On the Roman side stood roads, forts, taxes, law, and the self-conscious boundary of civilization as Rome understood it. Frontiers in the Roman imagination were rarely simple lines. They were zones of movement, control, exchange, and intimidation. But the wall remains one of the clearest visual symbols of an empire that had begun to think not only about how to advance, but how to define itself. Hadrian also deepened the cultural blending that had long characterized Roman power. He was famously devoted to Greek culture, perhaps more openly than any emperor before him. He admired Athens, sponsored building there, and reveled in Hellenic identity. Under emperors like Hadrian, the Roman Empire becomes impossible to imagine as merely a Latin-speaking military machine. It was a vast, multilingual civilization, with Greek and Latin both functioning as major languages of culture and administration in different regions. Syrian merchants, Egyptian priests, Gallic aristocrats, African landowners, Jewish communities, Greek intellectuals, and Roman officials all lived within the imperial structure, not equally, never equally, but within one connected world. Hadrian's reign, however, also revealed how fragile imperial order could be when local identity and Roman power collided sharply. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from AD 132 to 136 was one of the most serious uprisings Rome faced in the eastern provinces. The causes were complex, involving Roman policy, local resentment, and religious national resistance. The war was brutal. Rome eventually crushed the revolt with enormous violence. Judea was devastated, and Hadrian attempted to erase aspects of Jewish attachment to the land by renaming the province Syria Palestina and Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. Here again, Rome's peace showed its harder face. The empire could tolerate diversity in many forms, but when resistance fused identity, territory, and belief against Roman rule, the response could be annihilating. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, under whom the empire enjoyed relative internal calm, and then Marcus Aurelius, one of the most admired emperors in Roman memory. Later tradition grouped Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius together as the good emperors, though such labels inevitably simplify. What united them in reputation was the sense that under their rule, the empire was governed competently, rationally, and with less naked instability than before or after. This period has often been treated as the high point of Roman imperial civilization, and in many ways it was. Cities flourished across the provinces. Roads and shipping lanes linked markets. Roman law continued to develop. Local elites sought Roman office and prestige. Bathhouses, theatres, amphitheatres, aqueducts, temples, and forums spread a recognizable urban culture from Spain to Syria. Coins bearing the emperor's image moved across continents. Soldiers from one province served in another. Citizenship, though still not universal, expanded. Roman power offered something many pre-imperial systems had not sustained so widely for so long: a framework in which trade, administration, and mobility could operate across enormous distances with relative predictability. Yet even at this height, pressures were gathering. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign not in philosophical retreat, despite the meditative calm of his writings, but in war. On the Danubian frontier, Germanic and other peoples pressed against Roman borders with increasing force. The Antonine Plague, likely introduced from the east, spread through the empire and caused immense mortality. Disease weakened manpower, drained economies, and deepened anxiety. The image of Marcus Aurelius as philosopher-emperor is not false, but it can obscure the harder truth that his reign marked the beginning of a more troubled age. Rome was still powerful, but the effortless confidence of the earlier 2nd century was fading. When Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180, he was succeeded not by an adopted heir chosen for evident ability, but by his son Commodus. This mattered symbolically and practically. The old hope that the empire might be best preserved through meritocratic adoption gave way once more to bloodline. Commodus proved disastrous. Ancient sources depict him as vain, erratic, cruel, and obsessed with presenting himself as a gladiatorial hero. He liked spectacle, humiliation, and the language of divine self-display. Whether every charge is fair or sharpened by hostile senators, the broad pattern is clear enough. Under Commodus, the dignity of the principate seemed to decay into self-indulgence. He was assassinated in AD 192. What followed was a sign of the future. The year of the 5 emperors showed again that succession remained the empire's chronic weakness. Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and finally Septimius Severus emerged in rapid contest. Most revealing of all was the role of the Praetorian Guard and the armies. The empire had long pretended that legitimacy came through senate, law, and dynastic continuity. Increasingly, legitimacy came from military acclamation and the ability to defeat rivals. Septimius Severus, who emerged victorious, founded a new dynasty and ruled from AD 193 to 211. He was a capable and forceful emperor from North Africa, a reminder of how provincial the imperial elite itself had become. Rome was no longer governed only by old Italian aristocratic lineages. The empire had made Romans of many peoples, and now those Romans could rule the empire in turn. Severus strengthened the army, increased soldiers' pay, and relied heavily on military loyalty. This helped stabilize his reign, but carried long-term costs. The more emperors depended on the army, the more the army learned its own power. After Severus came Caracalla, remembered above all for one astonishing decision. In AD 212, through the Constitutio Antoniniana, he granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. Historians still debate his motives. Fiscal reasons likely played a role, as certain taxes applied to citizens. But whatever the reasons, the act was transformative. For centuries, citizenship had been one of Rome's greatest political tools, extended selectively and strategically. Now, it became almost universal among the free population. The distinction between Roman and provincial, at least in legal citizenship, was profoundly altered. The empire had become fully Romanized in one sense, but also less centered on the old city-state hierarchy that had once defined Romanness. And yet, legal inclusion could not erase military instability or economic stress. The 3rd century became one of the most dangerous periods in Roman imperial history. After the Severan dynasty weakened, the empire plunged into what is often called the crisis of the 3rd century. From AD 235 onward, emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Many were proclaimed by armies, ruled briefly, and died violently. Borders came under heavy pressure from Germanic confederations in Europe and the resurgent Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. Internal usurpations multiplied. Some regions broke away altogether. The empire did not collapse outright, but for decades it seemed dangerously close. This crisis was not caused by one simple factor. It was a convergence of military pressure, political instability, epidemic disease, economic dislocation, and the structural problem of ruling an enormous empire with no secure succession mechanism. Coinage was debased. Trade was disrupted in some regions. Town life suffered unevenly. Armies consumed resources. Emperors could scarcely govern long enough to establish legitimacy before confronting invasion or rebellion. One of the most humiliating moments came in AD 260, when the Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I. The symbolism was devastating. The ruler of Rome, heir to Augustus and Trajan, had become the prisoner of an Eastern monarch. Ancient and later tradition embroidered the story with scenes of humiliation, but even stripped of legend, the fact itself was enough. Rome's aura of invincibility was broken, and yet the empire did not die. In the later 3rd century, a sequence of tough soldier emperors began to restore order. Aurelian, who ruled from AD 270 to 275, was one of the greatest among them. He defeated external enemies, crushed internal rivals, and reunited the empire after breakaway states in the west and east had temporarily fragmented Roman rule. He also built the Aurelian walls around Rome, a striking acknowledgement that even the imperial capital could no longer assume safety by distance and prestige alone. The city that had once sent legions outward now enclosed itself in stronger defenses. The most far-reaching reforms, however, came under Diocletian, who seized power in AD 284. Diocletian understood that the empire had become too large and too unstable to be governed effectively by the old model of a single princeps pretending to stand modestly above republican forms. He remade imperial rule in a far more explicit and structured way. The principate, which had begun as veiled monarchy, gave way to what historians often call the dominate, a more openly autocratic style of rule. Diocletian reorganized the empire administratively, dividing provinces into smaller units and grouping them into larger dioceses for more effective oversight. Most dramatically, he established the tetrarchy, rule by 4, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior colleagues called Caesars. In theory, this provided geographical coverage, military responsiveness, and orderly succession. It was an attempt to solve the recurring problem that had plagued Rome for generations by turning personal monarchy into a managed college of emperors. He also reformed taxation, expanded bureaucracy, and sought tighter control over the economy and military recruitment. His court ritual became more elaborate, emphasizing the sacred distance of the emperor from ordinary subjects. This was no longer Augustus as first citizen. It was imperial majesty rendered visible and formal. Diocletian wanted the empire to feel governed, watched, and disciplined from above. His reign also saw the Great Persecution, the most severe empire-wide attempt to suppress Christianity. For generations, Christians had existed as a minority, sometimes tolerated, sometimes distrusted, occasionally persecuted. By Diocletian's time, Christianity had grown enough to be perceived by some imperial authorities as a challenge to religious unity and state order. Churches were destroyed, scriptures seized, clergy imprisoned, and sacrifices demanded. Yet the persecution failed to eliminate the faith. In a deep historical irony, the religion once persecuted as a threat would soon become bound to imperial power itself. After Diocletian retired, the tetrarchic system unraveled into fresh civil wars. It had solved some problems of administration, but not the deeper human reality that ambitious rulers and armies still fought for supremacy. Out of these struggles emerged Constantine. Constantine was another of the great turning figures in Roman history. In AD 312, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against his rival Maxentius, he reportedly experienced a vision connected to the Christian God. Accounts differ in detail, and the full nature of Constantine's religious development remains debated, but the political consequences are unmistakable. After his victory, Constantine increasingly favored Christianity. In AD 313, with Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting toleration to Christians and restoring confiscated property. Constantine did not make Christianity instantly or exclusively dominant, but he changed its destiny forever. He supported the church, endowed clergy, summoned bishops to councils, and involved himself in doctrinal disputes, most famously at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. The Roman Empire, once the persecutor of Christianity, now became one of its principal patrons. This transformation would shape Europe, the Mediterranean, and global history for centuries to come. Constantine also founded a new imperial capital on the site of Byzantium, refounding it as Constantinople in AD 330. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia, close to the eastern frontiers and major trade routes, the city was brilliantly chosen. Rome itself remained symbolically immense, but the empire's center of gravity had long been shifting. Constantinople would become one of the greatest cities in the world and the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. By the 4th century, the empire was no longer what Augustus had made, though it still carried his inheritance. It was more bureaucratic, more militarized, more openly autocratic, and increasingly Christian. Latin and Greek worlds remained joined but not identical. Regional differences deepened. The army continued to rely heavily on recruits of varied origins, including increasing numbers of Germanic peoples. Frontiers remained tense. The empire was still formidable, but its balance was delicate. Then came one of the most consequential movements in late antiquity, the arrival of the Huns in Europe and the chain reaction their westward pressure unleashed. Gothic groups, seeking refuge from Hunnic violence, crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376. Mismanagement, exploitation by Roman officials, and desperation turned this migration into rebellion. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Emperor Valens was killed and a Roman army shattered by Gothic forces. The battle sent shockwaves through the empire. It revealed that large barbarian groups within the imperial system could not always be controlled, and that Roman armies themselves were no longer reliably dominant in the old way. Theodosius I, who became emperor in the East, managed for a time to stabilize matters through diplomacy, settlement, and force. He also made Nicene Christianity the dominant imperial faith. But after his death in 395, the empire was divided administratively between his sons into eastern and western halves, a division that would prove enduring. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and more urbanized, would survive. The Western Empire, poorer in resources and under harsher military strain, would falter. The 5th century in the West was not a sudden collapse into darkness, though later memory often imagines it so. It was a prolonged weakening of central authority. emperors in the West increasingly became figureheads manipulated by generals, court factions, and external pressures. Germanic groups entered imperial service as federates, allies settled within the empire in exchange for military obligations. But such arrangements were unstable. In 410, the Visigothic king Alaric sacked Rome. The psychological impact was immense. Rome, though no longer the main political capital, was still the eternal city in imagination. To see it taken by a foreign army for the first time in nearly 8 centuries felt like the cracking of the world. Yet even after 410, the Western Empire endured. This is important. The sack was not the end, only a sign of deepening weakness. Roman institutions, law, taxation, aristocratic networks, and Christian church structures continued. Provinces were lost gradually. Britain slipped away. Parts of Gaul, Spain, and Africa fell under the control of emerging barbarian kingdoms. The Vandals seized North Africa, depriving the West of one of its richest regions and vital grain supplies. The Huns, under Attila, ravaged parts of the empire, though they too were ultimately temporary. The Western court moved between centers like Ravenna, safer than Rome itself. Finally, in 476, the Western emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic leader Odoacer. Later, historians often mark this as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It is a useful date, but also a simplification. No one in that moment could have fully seen it as the neat end of an age. Imperial titles, laws, institutions, and Roman identity continued in altered forms. Odoacer ruled Italy while acknowledging the Eastern emperor's nominal supremacy. The Senate still existed in Rome. The church grew in significance. Many people living through these changes would not have thought they had left Rome behind entirely. They were living through transformation, fragmentation, and adaptation, not a single dramatic sunset. And in the East, Rome did not fall at all. The Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians often call the Byzantine Empire, continued from Constantinople for nearly another 1,000 years. Its people called themselves Romans. Its emperors saw themselves as heirs of Augustus and Constantine. Greek became more dominant culturally, but Roman law, imperial ideology, and Christian statehood endured. Under Justinian in the 6th century, there was even a great effort to reconquer Western territories and codify Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, one of Rome's most enduring gifts to later legal civilization. Constantinople remained a center of wealth, diplomacy, theology, and power long after the Western imperial office had vanished. So when we speak of the fall of the Roman Empire, we have to be careful. Which Rome do we mean? The Republic died in civil war long before the Western Empire fell. The Western imperial office disappeared in the 5th century, but Roman identity and institutions survived. The Eastern Empire remained Roman into the 15th century, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Even beyond politics, Rome endured in law, language, religion, architecture, memory, and imperial dreams. Medieval emperors, popes, kings, revolutionaries, and modern states would all claim in one form or another to inherit Rome. That endurance is part of why the Roman story never truly ends. It begins in a cluster of settlements by a river, and becomes a republic of fierce citizen warriors. That republic conquers Italy, then the Mediterranean, and in conquering the world, destroys its own old balance. Out of its self-destruction rises the empire, brilliant, disciplined, adaptable, and often brutal. It spreads roads, cities, law, and citizenship. It absorbs gods, languages, peoples, and ideas. It crucifies rebels and builds aqueducts. It persecutes Christians and then crowns their bishops with imperial favor. It sends legions into deserts, forests, mountains, and marshes. It produces poets and tyrants, philosophers and butchers, reformers and usurpers. It is at once creative and violent, universal and unequal, magnificent and merciless. What made Rome great was not purity or goodness. It was capacity to organize, to absorb, to discipline, to recover, to imagine itself on a scale larger than any single people had a right to imagine. What undid Rome was not a single invasion or one bad emperor. It was the accumulated burden of scale, inequality, military dependence, political fragility, and the eternal human problem of succession and power. Rome could master provinces more easily than it could master itself. That had been true in the age of the Gracchi, in the age of Caesar, in the age of the 3rd century barracks emperors, and in the last weak courts of the West. Its structures were immense, but not immortal. And still, in a way, Rome was right about one thing. It did last beyond itself. Long after the eagles fell from Western standards, long after senators stopped debating under imperial shadows, long after the old pagan temples fell silent or became churches, Rome remained alive in the grammar of law, the map of cities, the ruins of roads, the domes and arches of architecture, the ambitions of rulers, the calendars of nations, the liturgies of churches, and the historical imagination of entire civilizations. To study Rome is not only to look backward into antiquity, it is to notice how much of the modern world still stands inside patterns Rome helped create. The empire is gone, the story is not.